Mr. John Forrest Little of the Pickaxe is visiting some of our resource deposits, and I've been tapped to take over these broadcasts. My name is Pixie Livingston, the news anchor for future broadcasts, and my specialty is reporting on resources and power. Our distinguished guest today is Mr. David Lee, who has an astounding professional and educational background in business analytics throughout the globe and, especially, Asia. He has been gracious enough to shed some light on the darkness with the villages in the northern precinct across the US, Canada, and Europe. Hence, they understand better what's going on with US foreign policy with China. We will be hearing much more from Mr. David Lee, who will visit us over a series of educational videos. This is important because Western media distorts what is really going on. After today, you will understand why Mr. David Lee is one of the best in breaking through the nonsense into consumable learning units. Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Lee. Please tell our viewers your professional background.
Okay, I just give a very brief introduction. I was trained as an engineer in the US. Then I worked down south in the auto sector, automotive component sector. And then after that, I did my MBA, eventually turned into a management consultant. I was starting my work in North America first, in the Midwest, and then I was sort of like shipped over to Asia to basically build the practice over there. And of course, I was bombarded with propaganda of how bad China is and worry about going to China at that time. It was back in the 90s. But then I went over there, saw it, and start to change my perspective. So I spent about 20 years in Asia Pacific, in Hong Kong, Beijing, and Shanghai. By the time I left my work, I was leading a practice for one of the major management consulting firm in China, focusing on everything from in the manufacturing sector, from mining, chemicals, all the way to automotive and downstreams. And I have given my engineering background, I have a little bit more focused on the supply chain manufacturing areas. Have moved manufacturing from the West to China, have moved manufacturing from China to Southeast Asia. So I have a little bit of a glimpse of everything's going on and all the development over in China for the last 20 years.
Thank you, Mr. David Lee. You have an impressive track record of success in engineering and business administration across all the key manufacturing sectors. So our subscribers will be very interested in hearing your insider knowledge about the world's largest infrastructure program, China's Belt and Road Initiative. What details or insights can you share with us this morning that most Western citizens are unaware of surrounding this new Silk Road infrastructure project?
I think you have to rewind back to about 2008, 2009 timeframe, when there was a major financial crisis, or the global financial crisis in the US. At the time, there was a lot of questions in Beijing. I happened to talk to some of these people in the think tank. They were all questioning whether the historical model of exporting to US, getting US dollar, buying US Treasury is the way to go forward. There was a lot of concern about China will be held hostage by the US government. So there was a lot of discussion about diversification. The question is, diversify to what? You can buy yen, you can buy euros. At the same time, is all G7. So they will be gang up against China at the end of the day. So there were questions about whether we should go to gold, whether we should go to something else. I think in 2009, Wen Jiabao at the time was the prime minister, actually called on the state-owned enterprise to really start thinking about outbound M&A. M&A means merger and acquisition. So you see a wave of M&A activities, buying assets. Some of those are well-known assets. Some of those are just buying the brand. Some of those are buying technologies. But soon they find out Western companies are not that eager to sell good technology to China. They can sell lousy companies to China. Once in a while, you can get a gem, but most probably you don't. So that outbound M&A using up the reserve currency doesn't really work in the long run. China, of course, at the same time, basically buy a lot of gold, adding up the gold reserve. And that's something that everybody talks about in Twitter right now. But there's also another concern is if eventually we run into problems with the West, how would China economy looks like? At the time, China was actually exporting a lot. Domestic consumption was very limited. It's only about 40% of GDP. Government basically have a lot of fixed asset investment, like building roads and so forth. But they are at the same time, they are running out of roads to build. They have already built a lot. Of course, in hindsight, it's still a long way from saturation. They're building a lot of high-speed rail and other stuff, infrastructure work. So at that time, around 2013, Xi Jinping start announcing the Belt and Road Initiative. At that time, was called One Belt, One Road. Is to basically to build a new Silk Road that connect Asia to Europe. So you have they have two parts. One is the marine Silk Road. So you basically build all the ports along the Asia coastal regions and all the way to Africa. The other one is actually building infrastructure all the way to Europe. There's a lot of questions at the time in China. Why doing that? Some people explain, China already manufacture 50% of global cements, 50% of steel. They have excess capacity. Doing Belt and Road Initiative can actually use up some capacity. That to some extent is maybe true, but you can't really solve all the problems. I think in hindsight, looking at it, is Xi Jinping actually has the vision to develop alternative market to bypass the stranglehold of Europe and US onto China. And so after 2013, Xi Jinping also called for a very interesting initiative called the Manufacturing 2025. You rarely hear that in the West, but Manufacturing 2025 means that by 2025, China needs to be able to manufacture all the core components by Chinese companies. And that is a very interesting thing to think about. If you look at historical development in China, they always import critical products, even for chemicals, even for steel, they imported it. So for example, in automotive, some of the high-end steel are all from Germany and from Japan. But over time, they developed the capability and they want to have homegrown manufacturing capabilities. And that is one thing that China actually focused on starting around 2014 and forward. And that actually raised a lot of questions in the West, especially in the US. By 2018 and 19, Trump basically initiated the trade war, and at that time was actually saying, we can actually sanction China, limit the technology migration to China, then we can actually move the manufacturing job back to China, back to US. Actually, it never really happened that way. The way that one of the major companies that were being sanctioned was in the technology sector is Huawei. Huawei at that time was the #1 cell phone manufacturer, and is actually beating Apple. And the way that US did was actually slow down, but actually force the Android from working with Huawei. And so Huawei at that time was an Android-based cell phone, and they don't even have operating system. And they have to come up with something called Harmony, which is not really that great at that point. But Harmony was actually something that was developed starting in 2012, very surprising. So Huawei actually had this foresight that someday down the road, they have to have operating system. And with that operating system, nowadays you evolve into, I think, 4.0, the 4th generation. And the Harmony is actually one of the best operating systems. It's used by about 700 million people, mostly in China, because they were sanctioned elsewhere. And that is the system that we can talk about it later on, because they are not just an operating system for cell phone, they are operating system for a lot of other things. And that is the vision that Huawei has, to actually link everything up. So from automotive to cell phone to everything in your office and at home. So all these things are, it sounds like that China has a very, very long-term vision. I would basically be a little bit more skeptical on that. I would say that China basically play a lot of scenarios in their planning. And given that they develop a lot of different things for different scenarios, no matter how the future comes, they have some kind of a solution to counter that. And with no one would expect someone like Trump would start a trade war, and with Biden basically double down on the trade war with China. But very surprisingly, China was very resilient on that and was able to overcome. So this is, in a nutshell, was why China actually need to basically develop the Belt and Road Initiative to actually bypass the Western stranglehold. And nowadays, their major trade partner is no longer US. No, US is only the third. And number one is ASEAN countries. And then number two is, I think, European Union. And then US is only number three.
That is an incredible answer, Mr. Lee. I was wondering if you have also heard about Mexico and the possibility of it also exceeding the United States.
There's an interesting piece about Mexico. A lot of the reshoring crowd is saying, hey, look at it. We are cutting down on trade with China. We're increasing trade with Mexico. The interesting part is Mexico-China trade actually exploded over the last few years. And you see a lot of Chinese companies investing in Mexico, and they're making the products to send to China, to send to US. So it is not trade with China, it's still trade with Chinese companies. And so it's just a different locations.
People in the West who tune into mainstream sources are often told by pundits or the milkshake simps, under Brent Johnson's disinformation, that the US is strong and the US dollar is strong. But please set the record straight, Mr. Lee. Could you discuss how US policy towards China is approaching suicide given the US dependence on active pharmaceutical ingredients, medical supplies, industrial chemicals, and other critical things that the US desperately needs, given that the US and Europe are net importers of things that make up the shopping cart for modern-day life in the West?
Well, the globalization that took place the last 20 plus years basically means that the supply chain is very much interlinked with each other. So you can't really cut off anything. So if I manufacture vehicles, I have a long list of parts that I need to have. And what we usually call that is bill of materials. So you have a long list of all the different components. And then I have, as an OEM, I would have a tier one supplier, for example, like Lear for seating. Lear would have their own tier suppliers with tier two and tier three and tier four, down to the very small screw and bolt. And if one of those parts is missing, your whole product will not be able to manufacture. And the problem that we saw during COVID was because of shipping difficulties, there were a lot of components that were missing. And so you have chip shortage, you have other product shortage, and as a result, you run out of parts to go into assembly line. The problem is a lot more problematic in some sector. So for example, in medical area that you mentioned, a lot of the active ingredients, a lot of the some of the final products, for example, antibiotics, are from China. And so if we are going to go into a trade war that eventually lead to an explosion of trade hostility, we run into problems that we can shut down a hospital. And that is something that no one wants to see. And I hope that the Chinese government will not do that. But at least at this point, we are being held hostage, I would have to say. And one thing that we can do is reshoring that. But the question is, do we have the incentive? Do we have the capability to do that? I've long hear a lot of people talking about, oh, U.S. can always reshore everything and bring back. Look at the 30s and 40s. We were basically running everything. The problem is not necessarily just the willingness, but also whether we have the infrastructure to do it. One thing that you need for manufacturing is electricity. Look at how much electricity capacity we have built over time. We have not a good infrastructure in terms of transporting all the goods around. Look at all the train accidents that we have. There's a lot of things that is missing. And the past 20 years, I would say, 20, 30 years, we have very much incentivized people to really go for the quick buck. So if you are very smart, you go into law degree, or you go into Wall Street to basically get the quick bucks. You go get an MBA, you make a lot more than an engineer. If you go to grad school across a lot of the universities in US, you see most of them are Asians, a lot of Indians, a lot of Koreans, a lot of Chinese. You don't see a whole lot of Americans basically doing that because it's not rewarding. Only those that do it for passion would go for that because the pay is not that great. And so as a result, we don't even have the talent to do it. I always talk about TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor. They're now building up a plant in Arizona. And I said it last year that this will be a case study of how reshoring will never work. And very surprisingly, by now, you see a lot of problems popping up. TSMC also building a plant in Japan. They are ahead of schedule. They are getting things done. In US, in Arizona, they are running into problems with the union. They're running into problems with building the plant was a problem. So you have a lot of, I would say that inherited issues that we have to solve it before we can actually do the reshoring. So there's a lot of things that we need to think through over time. It's not as easy as moving things from plan A to plan B.
I'm glad you brought this up. David just mentioned TSMC, which stands for Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. The Pickaxe just published how foolish it was that this investment location is happening in Phoenix, Arizona, where the Colorado River levels, Lake Mead, and Lake Powell all signal severe drought. This was the world's worst place to locate a semiconductor plant. Manufacturing these semiconductor chips is a water-intensive procedure. It takes an average of 2,000 to 4,000 gallons of water to produce a single semiconductor chip. This means a large semiconductor fabrication plant can use millions of gallons of water daily. We wonder the following: when God passed out the brains, it appeared he or she skipped over the decision makers in this particular case.
Unfortunately, the other places doesn't have the tax break that Phoenix offer.
And it's also not a political swing state important in the 2024 general election. The parasitic class still clings to antiquated institutions such as the undemocratic Electoral College, so let's keep this in mind. The last question today is, please enlighten the Northern Precinct subscribers on what Harmony operating system is and how US consumers are entirely unaware of this operating system, including discussing integration with home appliances, cars, and positioning it against Android, Apple's operating system, and Bluetooth technologies.
Okay. Well, I personally don't use Harmony because I'm in the US right now. And so I can't use Harmony because it doesn't link with a lot of the apps that I use. But in China, you have 700 million people already using it. The interesting thing about Harmony is it was first developed back in 2012 without any realization that China would be completely sanctioned off. And with the kicking off, with Android kicking Huawei off, Huawei need to have something of an operating system, and so they picked Harmony. But over time, Harmony develop a lot of different features, a lot of different connectivity. I think the interesting thing is if you look at what Huawei is talking about, Harmony is not trying to compete with iOS or Android. Harmony is a new vision of operating system that can work with everything, and they can connect with everything. So if you are in China, if you go into an EV, electric vehicle, as a passenger at the back, you can connect with the vehicle. And you, of course, you can't drive the vehicle, but you can actually control the climate at the back and everything. So everybody can do their own stuff. And if you go to your office, you can link up with your office. If you go home, you link up with your appliances. So that becomes if you're old enough to remember what we call a PDA, personal digital assistance, before we even have BlackBerry, those are the things that you are supposed to be able to connect with everything that you have in your possessions, and wherever you go, that will automatically link up with the system that you have, link up with the peripherals that you have, and then you can actually control everything through the palms of your hand. That's why at that time we call the Palm Pilot. Everything is on your palm, and of course, eventually a Palm Pilot merged into operating system that becomes the phone, the smartphone that we have. And so the question would be, at this point, Harmony is sort of contained in China because the other nations in the West would not use them and basically prevent any apps from working with them. But this is already a 700 million user market. Can the West really ignore it? The rumors is Qualcomm is already starting to think about working with Harmony so that they can actually help them to link up, and because it's a huge market, and also link up with all the peripheral. And if that is the case, that will be a breakthrough. The other thing is, with so many EVs actually going to the West and going to the global South, they need an operating system, and they will be using Harmony, for example. And then there's no problem with using Huawei products if in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, in Qatar, and everywhere else. And so they would form a much bigger population. And eventually, the iOS and Android might be not the preferred choice of those users. And that if that is the case, then the Western companies need to really start questioning themselves and whether they would be working with Harmony or not. And Harmony is just one of the interesting products that they come out. I'll talk about the manufacturing 2020, made in China 2025. Nowadays, there's a vision to be called a setting standard for 2035. So what it means is China would like to, because of its size, set the standard for the future, so that if you want to have a 6G, we will set this standard so that everybody would converge into that directions. And one of the things that we already see with the Huawei Mate 60 Pro, the new cell phone that they launched, is one thing I think is called NixLink. It's a technology that was set up, I think it's set up by Huawei. And the difference is NixLink is sort of like a merger of Bluetooth plus Wi-Fi. And it is much faster than Bluetooth. And you can link up with a lot more devices. And it actually is a much better system in terms of user interface to work with the personal device that you have. And so, for example, I can have the earphone link up with that. I can have less lag time. I can have faster speed, data transfer. But at the same time, I can link up with multiple. So if I have a headphone, if I have something else, multiple headphones, I can link them all up. And I think there's some limitation with Bluetooth. And so this is one of the things that we see that China is actually starting to push forward, and a lot of discussion right now in China is there's really no way that Huawei can develop to this stage without the sanction of US. It's only because of the sanction it pushed Huawei to basically find a way to get out of the sanctions, and as a result, they become much more innovative. And we see that Biden is still talking about more sanction coming, and we'll have to see what other innovations will be coming from the Chinese players.
Today's guest was Mr. David Lee, who spent most of his professional career as an engineer and business consultant managing most manufacturing sectors, everything from chemicals, textiles, automotive, and logistics across these sectors. David is also a metals and commodity expert. Next time we visit, we will get his insights on US media distortions that cover up poor planning on energy and foreign policy and staving off commodity shortages. Thank you, Mr. Lee, and we look forward to the next segment here on the Global Resource Nexus broadcast.